Final Fantasy XVI The Rising Tide is almost here. The brand new DLC that'll be adding an icon fight with Leviathan, and is said to add up to 10 hours of brand new content. The Rising Tide is going to be absolutely massive, and Square Enix DLC has a history of being even better than the base game. Looking at you, Final Fantasy XV. And today we got a brand new update from YoshiP, not only pertaining to Final Fantasy XVI's latest DLC, but also the team's strong desire to revive a legendary Final Fantasy spin-off that people have been begging to see again for years. So please go ahead and hit that subscribe button. We are just about to cross 96,000 subscribers, and every sub takes us a little bit closer to that goal. Recently, YoshiP sat down with publication The Gamer to discuss the brand new DLC, and in this interview they had quite a lot of interesting things to say. For starters, YoshiP talks about the development of 16, with him saying, when asking ourselves what is Final Fantasy, what kind of Final Fantasy do we want to do, we wanted to take it back to our roots, what we grew up with. Yoshida tells me through Koji Fox about the process of creating a game with more classical fantasy elements than we've seen in recent years. In this low fantasy setting, with games being HD quality, you have all these materials that are very dull. You don't have a lot of lighting or reflection. It was kind of difficult to make something that was going to pop. Indeed, in low fantasy settings, you don't have a bunch of crazy architecture, futuristic things with a ton of reflective metal surfaces, and LEDs put in them. Because of that, Final Fantasy XVI setting is a lot more grounded, with the mother crystals serving the purpose of also making these landscapes a lot more gorgeous to look at. Of course, ever since Final Fantasy X-2, one question that comes up every time there's a new mainline Final Fantasy game is, are you guys going to do a direct sequel? This is something that did happen for Final Fantasy XIII as well, with it being the first Final Fantasy game to ever receive 2 direct sequels and become its own trilogy. Some have wondered if YoshiP will do the same with Final Fantasy XVI, making a sort of Final Fantasy XVI 2. Here is what he's had to say. We're not thinking about making a sequel in this future without magic, with people living on their own terms. We want people to think about what they would think would happen in a world like that, and leave it up to the imagination of the player. Indeed, a lot of elements about Final Fantasy XVI's ending are quite ambiguous. However, one thing is not. People live their lives in the future without magic, and magic becomes a fairy tale of sorts. YoshiP continuing saying, you have this resource, this magic, and all of a sudden you take it away. Think about what would happen to us if we took away our technology or our internet. What would happen to the world? There'd be panic. There'd be all this chaos. But in Final Fantasy XVI's epilogue, you have that peaceful scene of a mother and her children. But you have to think, what happened to get there? Turning that into a game, is that going to be a positive experience? Of course, turning off the most valuable resource in the world, something that YoshiP equates with internet in our world, would indeed cause mass chaos, and I think is a narrative worth telling in its own right. The story of a world of people who lost their magic, and how they had to learn to live without it. That as a premise for Final Fantasy XVI 2 would be incredibly interesting, although making an interesting Final Fantasy game without the use of magic might prove to be a challenge, at least in terms of combat. You'd have to come up with ways for the characters to be able to use magic despite it disappearing from this world. The interviewer asked if they'd be interested in using Final Fantasy XVI for the base of a new tactics title. Koji Fox laughed and responded saying, what would we even call it? Final Fantasy XVI Tactics? That's a lot. However, the team is receptive to doing a brand new Final Fantasy Tactics game, with YoshiP saying, quote, we have a lot of our staff who worked on previous games like Final Fantasy Tactics or Final Fantasy XII, so you're going to have a lot of that tactics feel, because a lot of the same people are on the team. We're very happy for you to suggest this, because we're all fans, but if we're going to make this, we wouldn't want to do the same story that turns out to be a different story. How would we even do the icon versus icon battles in that style? If you have the icons, how many squares is the icon going to be? You have more people out there as well, so what about the time in between? But the series does lend itself well to that kind of storytelling, and we love tactics as well. It's probably about time that we do a new one. For Final Fantasy Tactics fans everywhere, this is pretty exciting to hear. Around 3 years back, a massive leak from Nvidia's GeForce Now database happened, and it leaked the announcement of tons of games, such as Kingdom Hearts 4, and these games all came way way ahead of their announcement. Of these titles, most have been either announced or released by now. However, one that still remains is Final Fantasy Tactics Remaster and Final Fantasy IX Remake. These are two titles that appeared on the list, a list that has been shown to be almost 100% accurate, yet these are some of the few titles that have not been announced yet, with them likely being delayed and stuck in development. It is hard to say when these titles will ever get their official announcement and much less their release. However, it seems that they're out there. I'm sure that YoshiP and the rest of his team would love to do a brand new Final Fantasy Tactics. However, I imagine that the release and success of Final Fantasy Tactics Remaster will determine if something like that gets approved. Because something like Tactics is a lot more niche, I'm sure they want to see visible demand for it first. Although since then they've made a number of games that have been inspired by FF Tactics, like Project Triangle Strategy and DioField Chronicle. But I think it's time not only for a proper Final Fantasy Tactics Remaster, as one of the few beloved FF games that you can't play on modern hardware, but it's also time for a brand new FF Tactics in general. And of course, before CBU3 can even worry about that, they need to finish Final Fantasy 16's DLC. Now, for those who are interested in this DLC and love FF16, I don't know if you felt the same way that I did, but personally, I wish that Jill just got more throughout the base game of FF16. It was really unfortunate. I think that we definitely needed more time with her, and more of the story focused on her own story arc. And finally, it seems like we're going to be getting exactly that with Final Fantasy 16 The Rising Tide, with YoshiP having this to say. In our first DLC, Joshua had a lot more lines, so he got to be a bit more front forward while Jill is in the back. In this DLC, Jill is more forward in this. The adventure takes place in a new area, in the Northern Territories, which is where Jill is from, so you get to hear a little more about Jill's past. There are parts of this story that connect in with Jill's story. It is so good to hear that we are going to be getting more Jill. To me, when it comes to potentially seeing more Final Fantasy 16 content, this is the number one thing that I want. And in everyone else's comments as well, whenever I ask the community, what do you guys want to see the most? The thing that you guys always say is that you want more playable characters, and if there's any character that you want to play as the most, it is almost always Jill. YoshiP has teased the possibility of maybe adding this into the PC version of the game, but it's nothing hard confirmed yet, and we're still left hoping if that's going to be something coming to the game. However, aside from that PC release, it does seem like Final Fantasy 16 The Rising Tide is the last hurrah for Final Fantasy 16. FF16 is a game that I have some tremendously mixed feelings about. On the one hand, it delivered some of the most cool moments that I've ever seen in AAA gaming. The Titan fight and the Bahamut fight were out of this world. This game has some of the best acting that we've ever seen in AAA video games, with arguably the best English voice track that Japanese video games has ever seen, period. Though there were many shortcomings as well. Many of the side quests, while offering some insight into Valistia and the lore of the world, were oftentimes a dread to play through from a game design perspective, and usually had you doing things like picking up dirt, fighting these same couple of trash mobs of enemies, and rinse and repeat, with nothing ever really happening to shake up the gameplay of these side quests. There were a lot of ups and downs with Final Fantasy 16, very high highs, and unfortunately some tremendous lows as well, but ultimately, I am still excited to play Final Fantasy 16 The Rising Tide. Square Enix DLC is notoriously good for making up for the base game shortcomings, so I'm hoping that Final Fantasy 16 The Rising Tide is able to bring me a sense of renewed joy with this game. With that being said, let me know in the comments below if you agree that we absolutely need playable Jill at some point, and I will see you all in the next video.